All right, welcome back, everybody. I always find it really interesting when a topic that has not even been on the radar before becomes its own panel topic at these events, and that's what's going on right now. Next topic is called AI and incident response, automating network defenses, monitoring, and response. And we have a great panel. I've been fascinated just listening to their pregame discussion as we lead up to the beginning of this panel. So this should be really good. Let me start off by introducing Robert Hudock, a partner in the data privacy and security practice group at King and Spalding. He's worked on some of the biggest data security incidents of the past decade. What makes Robert a cyber expert is not just his IR skill set, though, which runs a gamut from healthcare to retail to financial. It's also his technical advisory skill set, which lets him assess client security controls and practices for data protection and data security programs, while also complying with federal and state regulatory requirements. He happens to be a two-time winner as well of the DEF CON Capture the Flag competition, which is a cybersecurity competition for pro hackers. Welcome, Robert.
Thanks.
Our moderator today is Paul Luehr. He is one of the most experienced data breach lawyers anywhere. This is a very exciting day for Paul. He just moved over to become a cybersecurity partner at Manatt. Congrats, Paul.
Thank you.
He's known not just for investigating cyber fraud, but also for taking his cases to trial. He's a former AUSA, also former general counsel and managing director at Strauss Friedberg. Paul, congrats again and welcome. Good to see you.
Great to be here. Thanks, Bruce.
Always pleased to be joined by our friend Ed McNicholas, the data privacy and cybersecurity co-leader at Ropes and Gray, who has a long list of accolades and experience, including an extraordinary number of high-profile litigation matters. Ed's also a law professor at GW, where he teaches a course on cybersecurity and data breaches, and lead editor of the PLI treatise called Cybersecurity, A Practical Guide to the Law of Cyber Risk. Great to see you, Ed. Thank you for joining us.
Good to be here.
Our next speaker is Sean Spaniol, the head of cyber operations at Meta, where he leads the Meta FinTech cybersecurity operations team, including threat detection and response and cyber crisis management. That's the group that's responsible for all payments and financial services within Instagram digital collectibles, WhatsApp Pay, Meta Pay, Facebook Marketplace, ads billing, Quest, and the list goes on. Sean was formerly the head of cyber operations at Capital One, cyber program manager at the Department of Energy, and a network analysis team, lead at the U.S. Computer Emergency Readiness Team. Sean, great to have you with us. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
And finally, delighted to introduce our friend Luke Tenery, a partner with the global consulting firm StoneTurn. Luke has 20 years of experience helping large organizations mitigate complex cybersecurity, data privacy, and data protection risks. He's also certified as a CISO from Carnegie Mellon and a certified network penetration tester, which enables him to manage the investigation of a data security incident and also fix it afterwards with not just better tech, but better governance as well. On top of all that, I know that Luke recently added one more degree, an MBA from Northwestern, the Kellogg School. Welcome, Luke. It's great to see you.
Bruce, thanks so much. Always a generous welcome, so thank you for that.
All right, Paul, I'm really excited to hear this panel, and let me turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Bruce. And I'm excited to moderate this panel. You really have a team of experts in front of you on this topic. Want to begin with a standard disclaimer. Our panelists will present their personal views today based on their knowledge and experience in the field and do not reflect the activities or positions of their current or former firms, companies, or any particular client. With that, thought it'd be helpful to dip in first around a couple of definitions before we launch into our discussion. We probably could spend the entire session talking just about what AI means. So we don't want to get too far into the weeds, but I think it's helpful to understand that this concept really first came up during the early phases of computing. Alan Turing, sometimes called the father of computer science, wrote a work in 1950 called Computing, Machinery, and Intelligence, and asked the question, can computers think? And by the way, there's a nice write-up about this on IBM's page about AI. And one of the quote unquote Turing tests that he would apply was whether a human interrogator could distinguish between the computer generated response and a human text response. So some people have interpreted AI to mean, really, are we talking about systems that act like computers? I think more in a modern sense, we're really talking about complex computer science and where it meets robust data sets, large data sets to enable problem solving. I think that's maybe a more applicable and modern definition. But we already have AI around us. It's in things like natural language processing. We see it with Alexa and Siri. That's how they can understand you. We see it in facial recognition and authentication when you walk up to a machine and it recognizes you and your facial geometry. Recommendations on your video streaming service around which movies it thinks would be most appropriate. That really is a form, maybe an early form of AI. AI often can be broken into, I think, two parts. One is specific or purpose-driven AI for a particular type of task, or general purpose AI that we've seen more recently, where they're throwing AI out to the public and they're saying, here's a tool, you go out and use it as you see fit. Two types of AI that we see that are, I think, pretty popular and in the popular conversation right now, in the discourse right now, is machine learning. And that's often where we are starting the machine on a process, but the machine can then take over and perform another iterative task without having to go back and being programmed again. So it's really taking on part of its own programming function in order to perform one more task or perform another task in an iterative function consistently, and we hope with better clarity and accuracy as it moves along. And then, of course, what's really captured the attention of the world stage and the American public is what we call generative AI. This is where you give it some input, and as the name suggests, it is generating feedback back to you, often based on what we think of as large language or learning models underneath the overall programming. So with that quick introduction, the question comes up, how is artificial intelligence used in cybersecurity? Well, since we're in AI, we thought we'd ask the computers themselves. And here is a quick list as given to us by ChatGPT. How is artificial intelligence used in cybersecurity? Number one, threat detection to identify patterns and anomalies. And I'm paraphrasing here. ChatGPT gave me a very long answer. Two, behavioral analysis. To analyze unusual or suspicious behavior. Three, vulnerability management, to prioritize and address vulnerabilities in specific software. Four, fraud detection, to identify items such as credit card fraud or identity theft. Five, threat response, automating response to security incidents, including containment, eradication, and recovery, something we'll talk more about. And six, user authentication. So with that view from the computer itself, let me throw it over to the experts. And in particular, Sean and Luke, let me start with you folks as some of our technical gurus here. In your opinion, where is AI most effective at bolstering cybersecurity? Sean, maybe you can go first.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So from my perspective on the incident response and threat detection side, I have heavily utilized in my experience, not as much AI, but more from an automation perspective. And really the objective there is to support the contextualization and collection of data during the response activity to reduce the amount of time and effort that it takes the human to perform the full set of analysis. It also supports our ability to handle enormous volumes of data, and also to, like I said, to enhance the speed at which we're able to perform that response.
I can just add on to that. We've leveraged it in a detective realm. Primarily, we leverage a partner that really is in the practical application that a number of listeners might appreciate is endpoint threat detection. We leverage an analytics engine partner. They're actually named Red Canary. They sit on top of some of the more traditional now EDR platforms, and that automates a lot of our work, both on the detection side and the response, or the steps that you mentioned, Paul, from a detection, not just that, but containment, mitigation, et cetera. From a detective perspective, it's really working with some basic statistics in a lot of ways, but just at a massive scale. We may talk about this, and you alluded to it earlier, but there's aspects of AI that have been around for a really long time. It's just in recent years, the level of compute power, both with cloud and our ability to analyze just massive amounts of data. We just didn't have the practical resources to put some of the techniques and technologies to work. But now we know at least some of the preeminent tool sets available are starting to apply some of these things. They're leveraging the big data aspects, applying different statistical mechanisms to that. And to your point, it really gives us greater precision around identifying threats, removing the good, identifying what the good is to better identify the bad, and vice versa. In terms of the execution and mitigation as well, better decision making. We talked about it earlier, Paul. It's sort of, there's different levels. Generally in AI, there's a level 1 to level 5, 5 being the most autonomous, allowing the AI engine to kind of do the decision making and from soup to nuts, and then level 1 much less so. Cancer screening is a great example. I think we all agree that there's some level of additional precision that compute power can bring, perhaps not a fully autonomous basis, but perhaps somewhere in between where it's assisted by the machines. And I think that's a good way of characterizing security at some level. It's not fully autonomous yet, but it's definitely starting to already make aspects of security response much better.
So some of the buzzwords that I'm hearing are things like basically pattern matching, greater precision, detection, speed, and volume. And I think especially speed and volume is what I'm hearing. I mean, any of us who have dealt with an incident know that logs are voluminous. I mean, and in fact, one of our big nemesis or foes in incident response is the automatic deletion of logs that occurs every 3 days, every 30 days, every 90 days, whatever it is. We always want more. And in fact, if we had more, now we have another reason where logs could be very important because of that volume and pattern matching or analysis that can occur through AI. Now, traditionally, definitions were a really big deal early on, for example, in antivirus. And we all remember when you would upload your definitions file in order to maintain the currency of your antivirus. But now we hear about heuristics, suspicious activity. What if I'm logging in at 3 a.m. from Norway, as an example, where I should be logging in at normally at 10 a.m., let's say, from Washington, D.C. Is that something that AI is going to pick up on?
Yeah, I think the advantage there, Paul, is, adding on to what Luke was talking about, we can evaluate these norms on a per user basis, and we can use this extra compute to support that, to support the extra work there. We can check their paid time off leave status in an HR system. We can check the location of their phone or the country from which they have been connecting from historically over long periods of time. And we can get all that data, put it in one place, and have the computer make the decision for us, or at least make a recommendation in terms of whether it is above or below a preset threshold compared to the baseline norms.
Great. And that kind of leads to another question I had. Luke, maybe you can address. I hear a lot of chatter in the security world about automated playbooks. In fact, I got 2 calls. I'm not in charge of the computer security operation, at either my previous firm nor my current firm, but doesn't stop them from calling me and hawking their wares. And I always like to pick their brains. But in both of those vendor calls that I received, which were around heavy security tools, they talked about the new automation that they could introduce into our environment. So can you talk to me about that and playbooks and how we're seeing that being incorporated into AI?
Yeah, for at least a few years now, organizations have started developing. We use playbooks, and oftentimes in the context of like an IR planning session, but we also are thinking that way from a tools and techniques standpoint. So an example might be certain ransomware conditions are ensuing in a network, not just mitigating that malware itself, but are we thinking about allowing those security systems to enable other sort of controlling functions, like say even taking an enterprise off the network proactively and making decisions like that. That would be an example of a workflow or a playbook that an organization might consider. But I do think, just from a decision-making process, and I think Sean touched on it a little bit, that feeds into the playbook piece, is just the much greater ability for some of these toolings to contextualize different things. So there could be a number of other conditions that, again, we use the analogy of the doctor screening. There's a shortage too. It's not necessarily the complexity at all. It could be a timeliness issue. And so with the still continued shortage at some level of cybersecurity talent, the same example is used in certain countries that don't have the benefit of the population of doctors that we have. Really an opportunity to scale certain ability to execute at another level is certainly much more achievable now with some greater, to use an acronym of our partner, there's sort of an acronym of ACT, accuracy, correctness, and timeliness. AI just gives us the ability to really scale certain things, probably even more quickly than a human could react or respond on some of these.
I've seen this particularly true among small to mid-sized businesses where they might have a CISO, they might have one or two people on internet security if they're lucky, but they don't have somebody who can look at a set of logs 24/7. And they certainly don't have somebody who can immediately look at, for example, an executable that shouldn't be on their network and say, not just suspend that, but stop it from executing in the first place. Where I'm seeing some of these AI tools, especially if you put them into full protect mode as opposed to learning mode. We'll talk more about that. If you put them in full protect mode, in essence, your playbook is being executed for you, and it won't allow that exe file to kick off because it's part of the overall solution. I want to turn slightly now. We've heard some great ways that AI is used in a defensive posture, but I'm guessing since it's so effective as a defensive weapon, I'm assuming the hackers are also going on the offensive and using AI against us. And Robert, maybe we can start with you and maybe touch on social engineering. What are you seeing in the market?
Certainly. So the offensive use of artificial intelligence is something we're already seeing with ChatGPT 3.5 and 4, where it can actually construct relevant and useful for social engineering perspective emails. And so as a consequence, they can demonstrate a level of knowledge and industry specific sort of context that you don't normally get in a social engineering type attack. We also have even more nuanced social engineering attacks where fake news or media is created and then leaked to message boards, and it's convincing enough that it can manipulate, potentially the stock price of a company or convince somebody to send a wire transfer. So that's, around the social engineering aspect, that's one area. But in addition to that, we also see where the ChatGPT can actually be used to write malicious code. And so, actually understanding how to write effective ransomware can be quite challenging. And so if you phrase your prompts in a certain way, you're able to, get ChatGPT to give you different components and provide recommendations on how you might, as an adversary, attack an organization. And so there's lots of variety in the ways that this can be used. One scenario that I was thinking of just the other day, we see sort of the evolution of ransomware attacks, and that the hackers now dump all that data to the public internet. But imagine if instead of dumping that to the public internet, they fed it into something like ChatGPT-4, where it has a very large context, and then you ask ChatGPT, how, what information here is the most sensitive, and how can I harm this organization the most? And sort of it's a reverse document review where ChatGPT is being used to analyze the context of the information that was stolen by the hackers in order to provide advice on how they might make a profit.
Okay, Robert, you got to stay on the side of the good guys, okay? Promise me that. Yeah. I'm scared of how you're thinking.
Paul, if I could jump in,
yeah, Ed, please.
I just want to mention this idea of the explosion of ransomware we saw when ransomware as a service became available, because it turns out that not all the hackers are as smart as Robert. A lot of them are kind of low skill and, a bit lazy. And ransomware as a service was really beneficial for them in terms of their having a help desk to help them deploy ransomware more effectively. And ChatGPT could be that help desk for hackers, which will take down the skill set and, take down the barrier to entry and allow more people to jump into hacking, which, we don't need the publication of hacking for dummies.
Right. No, that's a very good point. I had one case recently where you could actually tell there might have been two different threat actors that were cooperating with each other, because one of them in the chats was almost very British and polite. And then about 12 hours later, the next person who came in as part of the negotiations in chat was throwing down the F-bomb like they were from Brooklyn or something. And you're like, okay, there's more than one character involved here, but they were using the same platform and they were maybe part of the same crew. But your point is well taken that this is technology that unfortunately is leveling the playing field on the other side, and that makes it more difficult for us. I've got several questions in here I want to make sure we're addressing. Several people have said, do we think that state actors are using AI against us? Maybe you could comment on that.
I think that one thing, if you look at some large-scale hacks, like the Yahoo hack, for instance, where the Russians pulled an enormous amount of information, or the OPM hack, where the Chinese pulled everybody's security clearance file, including mine. Not that I'm annoyed by that. But why would you want everyone's file? Well, I think that these data sets are out there, and they will have the ability to scan these data sets and provide much more detailed information. So I think some state actors are accumulating large data sets and then using them to search for interesting information, vulnerabilities, and that I think that's going on today, and it will only accelerate as the technology improves.
I would agree. They most certainly have the resources, the know-how, and when I say resources, the cloud compute, as well as the data sets, to Ed's point. I think it's also interesting to just kind of highlight a few things about AI, though, in terms of the security risks associated with it. In a good way, there are some nascent or burgeoning, sort of set of taxonomy around vulnerabilities with AI. NIST, within the last year, if not the last 6 months, recently published a white paper around identifying and mitigating AI risks, and they talk about some of the more common ones, the one that we've talked about here amongst us friends, is sort of the sort of almost an injection attack where the AI model understands a stop sign looks a certain way with certain colors and bold letters, but what happens when an adversary, because that AI model is ideally learning something, gets sort of sent pictures. And this is a basic analogy of getting sent pictures of a slightly different stop sign that looks more for, instead of red, the color green. And so cars drive through the red stop signs because they're looking for green ones now. But those types of vulnerabilities are being vetted out. There's almost sort of a grassroots now. I would consider grassroots, but an AI risk symposium, part of ACM, which is proactively kind of identifying and thinking about already in a good way security vulnerabilities associated with AI. But I'll just say, if they're thinking about it, the adversaries are most certainly thinking about it in terms of what they could be doing for evil, nefarious, or other purposes. So it's very much like what Black Hat or RSA has been, and how they've matured aspects around identifying vulnerabilities. I would say AI is much more infantile, but even more broadly, definitely using it for nefarious purposes. We're highly confident with what we've seen that one or more tools like ChatGPT have been used to develop, I wouldn't say novel malware, but malware in a sense that may not be as easily detectable as previous generations of it, for sure.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Sean, because we've got many people in our Q&A asking about what are the risks, and that was the next agenda item for us to talk about. And you've raised a very important one, and one that some of our viewers have asked about is how could this be used against us, and are they actually potentially hacking into a security or a tool like ChatGPT, or maybe even another tool to make the threat even that more aggressive. I think what I have seen in my own personal experience is that we've seen a real uptick, I think, in hackers actually going after security tools themselves, secure transfer platforms, which affect then not just one person, but multiple parties across the platform. And I think that's something that we have to be ready for. And I think AI tools are going to be part of that mix, which gets into the question, I think, of the cleanliness of some of the data that's used as an input, because you can turn AI against us if you've got dirty data, you might say. And Sean, isn't that maybe one of the risks of AI? It works best on clean data, but maybe you could say something about that.
Yeah, I mean, going back to your example on whether or not nation states are potentially using AI in offensive attacks, the advantage of building your own models, which, by the way, is very expensive and time consuming, is that you control what those inputs are. And, to Luke's point around the stop sign example, if you can train your own model with existing data that is relevant to the type of data that you're going to be analyzing going forward, that gives you a large advantage from a data quality and making sure that you achieve your objective on what the outputs are of that analysis that's taking place. So there's definitely an advantage to, again, owning the model and being able to make sure your data is clean, but it is more expensive and likely out of reach for many of the different threat actor groups.
So just to carry on with that, I have seen in the last month or so, and some language models have been leaked that tend to be pretty sophisticated, and language models once built can be tuned, and it's relatively inexpensive in comparison to making your own language model. And in fact, just the other day, I was able to run GPT for All is a sort of a project on GitHub. You can look up and you can download and run a language model, sort of like ChatGPT, on a high-end MacBook Pro. And so I think that we'll see that the barriers to entry here are going to come down. The other sort of issue I see with data cleanliness isn't just cleanliness in training the tool, but the data that was used to actually build the product or the model is like legally authorized. And the people that served, maybe it's videos of us here at our giving this presentation, in theory, this could be used to reconstruct, synthetic presentations using
Come on, imitation is the best form of flattery. Or just copying.
So there's a legacy aspect of it that raises a number of legal issues and concerns.
Yeah, and that was something I wanted to throw to you, Ed. Maybe you could highlight, and all of us could jump in, but we're talking not just about technical risks, but AI, while it's, I think, very valuable, I've always used the phrase, we need to use technology to beat technology. We'd be silly to sit on the sidelines and say, well, we're not going to deal with AI because it's complicated and there's some scary stuff out there. I do think we have to embrace it, especially as a legal community in the IR space. But there are some legal risks, and maybe you could talk about some of those and maybe where we're going with potential regulation.
Yeah. I mean, you could always watch the movie Megan to talk about when you go into full protect mode, what could go wrong with that. But stepping back from the horror movie example, I look at, Article 22 of the GDPR, and a data subject shall have the right not to be subject to a decision based solely on automated processing, including profiling, which produces legal effects concerning him or her, or similarly significantly affects him or her. And if you think about the experience of, let's say, American Muslims after 9/11, who were thrown onto a no-fly list and said, wait, I'm from Ohio. I'm a tech executive. What are you talking about? Who can I appeal to? And at first, there was no appellate process. And it took years for DHS to get an appellate process. So you can get a redress number and say, yeah, this guy is a tech executive from Ohio. He's not a terrorist. Take him off the list. We have, that problem. And if you are, you can't log on to your bank because you're doing something that AI has deemed to be suspicious. And so the bank security system keeps knocking you back off. Well, how can you appeal that? How can you say, no, I don't know what's going on, but I can't get in? And I think that the GDPR is going to be something that we have to pay attention to in this environment. And it's, that rule, interesting. I mean, that has been around for a long time. That came from the directive in 95. And it didn't make a lot of sense in 95. Like, really, the computers are going to make a decision without human intervention? That would be cool. Now it's seems prescient. I also look at this in terms of, we've got 5 white males here on this manel. And we are talking about surveillance. And this today, Pew put out a real formal research study on attitudes towards AI. And it seems that people who are higher in the socioeconomic status don't see as many problems with it. But if you are lower in the socioeconomic status and have, lived experience of people using surveillance and stereotypes against you, you're much more suspicious about AI. And so I think before we roll out systems that are going to be blocking people off of networks, we should be aware that some of the, it might not have as much popular support as it would be among a bunch of incident responders and attorneys. And it also might reflect some of the pattern of racial and ethnic and gender disparity because that's reflected in the training sets even if we don't, we don't see it in the training sets, it might still be implicit in there. And so I worry about the EEOC coming in here as much as the FTC in terms of people being able to substantiate claims that they make about AI. The other piece I want to mention is that workers have rights under the NLRB to organize at the workplace. And if we're surveilling that in the name of cybersecurity, you could wind up before the NLRB. So before rolling this out, there's a lot of analysis to be done in terms of the potential regulation here. And I think one of the longer term risks in this area is seen in the White House recent declaration with cybersecurity strategy, where they're trying to push liability back onto software manufacturers and change the culture around software manufacturing, that you just don't, hey, it works a little bit, throw it out and we'll see what it does. If we do that and then we'll just iterate, we'll just do another version if there's a problem with it. If software manufacturers are going to be liable for the problems in version 1.0 and 1.2 and 1.3, we're going to see a much different culture. So we should watch where the White House goes with that piece on, and that's in the cybersecurity strategy, not to mention the AI Bill of Rights and similar provisions we're seeing out of Europe. Paul, you muted yourself.
I knew that was going to happen at some point. I'm glad you mentioned that, because on the other side of it, I think we're also going to see pressure to actually adopt AI kind of no matter what, and take it with some warts, because it's so effective. I worry a little bit it will be adopted maybe in whole cloth, kind of like MFA seems to be pervading the market right now. Look at the FTC consent orders. They haven't come right out and said lack of MFA, multi-factor authentication, is a violation of Section 5 of the FTC Act, but they're pretty close. It is almost in every unfairness consent order that you see now. And I could see, because AI is so good at so many things, especially on the perimeter of a network, on some of these detection tools, that there's going to be a real pressure from one side to include that AI tool. And yet you bring up a great point, Ed, where that network ability meets the human being. Now we have to contend with other risks, namely excluding people unfairly for lots of reasons.
And one thing you might want to think about is like compliance work, where AI, if you have a non-discrimination policy in a workplace, are people going to be expected to use AI to scan through all the Slack logs or all the IMs and search for derogatory terms? And does it matter who's using those terms and the social context of those terms? And if employers don't do that, will that be seen as not policing the workplace?
Right.
Right. I think it can get even more interesting than that, where maybe the regulators, imagine the Federal Trade Commission has a expert system that goes out and scans websites, reads the privacy policy, and then finds indications of where the site does something inconsistent with what the privacy policy says. And then they file some sort of administrative action to, with the organization. And so things that were impossible to do before, like apply regulations uniformly across entire populations. We could see that with the government adopting it for, tax compliance or privacy compliance, and the, sort of the unintended consequences and the chilling effects that might have on the business and on individuals would be incredible, because the government doesn't have unlimited resources, but it very soon can.
If you can audit every tax return.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Paul, I was just going to weigh in. I do think there is a gold rush to AI. Candidly, like we've seen recently with digital assets and crypto. there's most certainly going to be traffic accidents or what have you. Perhaps bad analogy. Strike that from the record. But you know what I mean in terms of people deploying it in a highly immature context for some specific benefit while not monitoring the broader controls around it. I think we're probably already seeing that. We know that it's been employed, or regulatory pressures have happened in New York and Colorado, most recently, where they're trying to prevent whether it's bias or some other issue. That also speaks to aspects of the integrity of not just the models but the data sets, knowing where the data actually is that the model's learning. Those are all going to be key issues that I still think the common or lay person wouldn't know one way or another how to discern the risk factors for any particular software that they're engaging with. So I think we'll likely see some pressure, both because we have to, Paul, leverage these technologies to keep up with the bad guys, but at the same time, there's going to be the amount of calories on your soda equivalent of what kind of AI you're getting served up to you and how it's operating. I think there's going to be some balance to that eventually, but I think unfortunately probably some immaturity along the way.
Yeah, and you bring up, so we've talked about regulatory risk, we've talked about privacy risk, we've talked about the risk of discrimination. I think two other ones I'll just mention briefly before we close out. We hear a lot of chatter about IP risk, intellectual property. When I have a learning model, whose data is that? I recently, as I'll tell you in a moment, a little party favor, looked at a graphical model. And when I generated some graphics, down in the corner was a different website that I had never seen before. It begged the question, did somebody get a license to this particular picture? And more broadly, whose data has been inserted into a learning set? And then once you have a solution, who owns that solution? Is it part of the AI tooling companies' intellectual property? Some people would argue it's nobody's intellectual property because it was generated mathematically. Right, which is a concept that's out there in patent law, that you can't patent a mathematical algorithm. So I think there's some real intellectual property issues that we'll have to struggle with. And then one that's often brought up, especially with generative AI, is confidentiality. Especially us as lawyers, we have to be very careful about feeding into, for example, ChatGPT, information that's strictly confidential and proprietary to our clients, because that could then get out there as part of the learning model. It keeps on building itself. And now somebody else could see what normally would be held under wraps because we weren't very careful. But we did bring up, I think Ed touched on this point, kind of the humans versus computers. And I wanted to touch on one final point, which is, are we seeing the death of the legal and technology industry because AI is going to take over?
Absolutely not. I mean, in the same way you saw when Westlaw came out, and I'm old enough where I had to shepherdize things by hand. And then I saw Westlaw did the shepherdizing for me. Great. I'm very happy we don't have to shepherdize. And right now, already, when we go in and do an internal investigation and we gather up a whole bunch of documents, it's not like we print them out and search through them. We use machine learning to go through and say, we're looking for documents that talk about the bribery in Norway. I don't know why we're picking on Norway today. We'll pick on Norway. The bribery in Norway, and we can find those documents relatively easy. We don't have associates sitting there going through document by document. And that sort of module will be great because it will focus attorneys on higher value work and avoid, some of the scut work that used to be here. So, I mean, if your practice is fighting parking tickets, it might be a problem. But I think for higher value work, it's not going to be an issue.
So let's end there. And since I let the computer have the first word, I'm also going to let AI have the last word. I did ask ChatGPT, will AI reduce the need for attorneys and technical professionals in working on cybersecurity? It answered with a very long, verbose answer. And I said, please reduce it to 4 main bullet points. And it gave me 4 main bullet points. And it said briefly, AI has the potential to automate some tasks in cybersecurity and law. However, human expertise and judgment are still critical for interpreting legal principles, designing, implementing security solutions, and negotiating complex settlements. So we'll let them have the last word. And by the way, is a bit of a party favor for you. If you go and look at the resources tab, I've taken 2 different aspects of ChatGPT. I asked the questions we talked about here. It generated responses, and then I took that generated response and threw it into a visual tool, and it created 2 videos for us. So in your spare time, not while another panel is talking, please go and check those out. I think you'll find them both a little informative and maybe just a bit humorous as to the graphics that were chosen to go along with our text. And with that, Bruce, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Paul. I just checked in that resources. I didn't see it, but I'll make sure they get put in there as soon as possible. If maybe I missed it, maybe they are there. Hey, terrific job. What an interesting and timely panel. Thank you all, Ed, Sean, Luke, Robert, and Paul. Terrific job, and we will see you all again soon.